It was really nice for Steve Saxty to sit down and spend some time with me talking about the BMW 2002 in 2002 story, and it was very nice for him to share the pictures from the book and also the story from the book, which of course he discovered. So anyway, here's the full interview. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for joining us. This is wonderful to be able to talk to someone who's had such great access to BMW. And let's talk first about the BMW O2 series back in the 60s, the original 2002. So what was the cultural impact of that car?
It's one of those cars that probably encapsulated what was the modern BMW for the last 50, 60 years, which is a small, compact, sporty car. And there's the Neue Klasse, which is the 5 Series size car, and then the O2 series, which was a spin-off from it, so a cut down, almost a version of the Neue Klasse platform. And that was essentially the car that was succeeded by the 3 Series. So it really put the company on the map, particularly with US buyers. So before that, BMW is such a small niche manufacturer that really it wasn't widely known in the US, but there was this seminal road test in, I think it was Road and Track magazine in the US, that said it's the finest driver's car you can buy. Basically set the US market on fire for that vehicle. And then sales really took off in the US, put the company on the map. And it also made the company become more international. And that's probably quite important, because suddenly this small Bavarian company that's making a fraction of the number of cars it does today had to start thinking about serious volumes in export. So it changed its reputation and it changed the company, and obviously brought in a lot more volume and a lot more profit for the company than it ever really had before.
And obviously then they started with the 1602, but then it got to the 2002 and then there were turbo variants. So how was that received by American customers, and what was so special about those really fast O2 series BMWs?
Well, the really fast ones, the 2002 Turbo was more of a sort of a European car in that respect for helping the company race, and it was, although an icon today, didn't really sell that well at the time because it ran straight into the oil crisis. So it's like a lot of these cars we all lust after today. In their time, they were perhaps a little bit more difficult to sell. But the TI, the vehicles with the fuel injection stuff, that was really where the sweet spot was, because it was affordable and it was sporty. So that was, as most car companies do, they released the sportier versions a little bit after the main sort of mainstream production vehicle. So yeah, incrementally the car got sportier and more appealing as it developed through its lifespan.
So then we get to, so then the 3 Series was released, and that's a massive success for BMW, and then they go on a rip and become very successful throughout the 80s. And then we get to the 90s, and some people within BMW start thinking, hey, 2002 is coming up. So who was the first person to really think about that?
Well, this goes to, I'm going to, in my mind, think it's very clearly Andreas Sapatinus, but there's a story around that. So Andreas Sapatinus, for those that are Alfa fans, later became the head of design for Alfa Romeo. But before that, he was at BMW, and he's a Greek gentleman who had a 2002 when he was studying in New York. So he moved to the US and had a 2002. So he's always had this love of 2002s. And he even owns one today. Now he's retired, he's actually got the 2002 in his garage. And the brief at the time was to do the cut down what would be eventually the 3 Series compact. So the lower cost, shorter in body structure, 3 Series. And the designers love all these ideas of these quirky cars. And so others had played with the idea of instead of making this an entry-level compact hatchback type of cut-down car, is to say, well, why don't we go back to our roots and make this a really compact car like the original O2 series? But it was Andreas who absolutely thought, well, hang on, we've got the year 2002 coming up, and this is when this vehicle will be launched. Why don't we make it a 2002 for the year 2002? And he scrolled on some of his drawings, sort of 2K2, so it was 2K2 for 2002. Sort of thing. But again, I've seen one of the other designers, Adrian van Hooydonk, who's now the group chief designer. He also drew a car at the same time, and he wrote 2002 on it. So it wasn't like nobody else had the idea, but Andreas's car was very much leaning towards what would look like a production car in these early sketches that were then turned into a 3D model. So that's really where the genesis of the whole project began, was Andreas's thoughts for what could be a 2002 compact.
Okay, so
sorry,
then
3 Series compact, sorry.
Right, got it, yeah. Okay, so Andreas is doing his thing, he's creating some great designs, and then Ralph Langmuir comes into the picture. So how did that happen?
Well, there's a bit of a gap, actually. So Andreas did his car, and it wasn't selected as the final design. And so as a consequence, the design sort of sat around unused. But Ralph Langmuir, who's an engineer, also had and still has a 2002 as well. All these people have 2002s at BMW. And his is a very rare Bauer convertible, so he's particularly proud of that. Ralph is now a very senior engineer at Rolls-Royce, but back in the day there, he was studying advanced composite materials. And he had heard that somebody in design had sketched a 2002 looking car. And he thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could make a running vehicle that is using composite technology to strip down a 3 Series and turn it into a running 2K2 type 2002 style vehicle. So at that point, Andreas's sketch work had sort of been left a bit. And it was when Ralph went to Chris Bangle, the head of design at the time, and said, could we kind of pick up on this, and actually I'd like to make the thing. And that's really where the whole idea then got going into making an actual drivable vehicle from it.
Okay. And so how did the first running prototype get greenlit?
There's a really quite romantic story behind it, actually, I think. So in BMW circles, there's a man called Max Riesbock, who is just a legend in the sort of nerdy side of the history of BMW, where he built the first 3 Series station wagon at home. So he was a prototype builder, and he wanted a station wagon, but BMW didn't make a 3 Series station wagon, so he built it at home. And it was so well liked that the company bought it off and put it into production. So I had dinner with Max. He said, well, this is like true, or is this sort of dreamt up? And he said, well, no, it's completely true. They bought my car off me, sort of thing. So he bought a crashed car and built it, basically. So Max, although he's famous for that, did actually have a day job building prototypes. So Ralph Langmuir and the designer that took over the advanced side of design, Thomas Plath, drew up what was an exterior shape and the concept of using composite panels, lightweight fiberglass type panels that you can stamp, and said to Max, do you think you can make one of these? And these guys are heroes to me because they can just make cars in a few months. You can just drive them down the road. And I'm like, I would take years to do this sort of thing. So Max looks over and he says, yeah, sure. You give me sort of 3-4 months. I'll make that for you. No problem at all. So he's given this sort of rough idea, and then he returns back with the car as a fully drivable vehicle and an instruction manual how to make it, as if they chose to put it in production. So this genius guy basically says, oh yeah, and here's the instruction manual, like a kit. If you actually want to make it, that's how I made it, sort of thing. And so that's how the car got constructed in a space of 4 months in secret. It was no real approved program for production or anything like that. It was really a test vehicle, but it looked so production ready because it was styled by Thomas Plath, who's a talented designer. So the consequence is it looks pretty much ready to hit the road, as indeed it could have been. And it had a very radical back to basics interior too. So it was a very well thought through car. That's why people loved it so much.
It must have been cool to actually find that in the back catalogue of BMW, find that prototype and roll it out. What was that like?
Well, that amazed me. So the sort of story behind it, I've mentioned there, but it came to me via two different sources. One is talking to Andreas, to Chris Bangle, and I realized that it had different names. So at some point it was called the Beamer, which was its code name, which Americans say Beamer, but Germans say Beamer, Beamer. And I realized that they were talking about the same car, and I thought, oh, okay. And then Chris said, well, I think I've got one photo for it somewhere. And I got this. I thought, this is a really cool story because, as I mentioned, it was a running car, and they presented it to the board completely unexpectedly when the E65, the 7 Series of the early 2000s, was unveiled, the radically styled E65 7 Series. And they just drove it around and parked it up. So it was this sort of static display. And somebody hurtles around in his car and said, ta-da, here it is, very dramatic. So I thought, wow, that's quite a story that car's got to tell. But how do we tell the story without seeing the car? And so I made some inquiries at BMW Classic, and they said, yeah, I think we've got it in storage, actually. And I'm like, really? And they've got all these cars stored away, and that's a whole separate story. And I thought, oh. And the guy at BMW Classic knows my next question. He goes, well, would you like to see it then? Now, the problem is I live in New York, he's in Munich. I can't keep jumping over to see a car. I said, well, yeah. He said, I'll take some photos for you with my phone if you like. I'm like, I can't really use, set of photos from someone's phone in a quality book sort of thing. So I then phoned up Adrian Van Hooydonk, the chief designer. I said, look, they're willing to get the 2K2 out of storage. And he said, that's great. He said, I didn't even know it still existed. I remember that thing. And I said, well, look, is there a chance that you can let me have one of your photographers shoot it properly? Because it deserves to be told well with some decent photos. He said, yeah. That's no problem at all. So there's a lovely lady, Birgit Bitterman, who I've worked with on the book, went over there and shot some photos. So this car has never been out in daylight in, 30 years? And they didn't know, they could have started it up, but the engine had probably not been started in like decades, so they didn't want to take a risk. So it's sort of been pushed out gently into the sunlight, and it's all hidden under covers. And even in storage, it has camouflage on it. So all the camouflage was stripped off the photos because it's never been revealed, never been seen in public. So to my amazement, we have these photos of it out there in sunlight, looking for all the world like it's ready to hit the road.
So obviously you didn't get to drive it and we can't drive it now, but what was it like to drive when it was first created?
Well, the good news is it was driven pretty hard, actually. And this is the thing about these prototypes is people get a bit carried away. And so they took it up to the Aschheim test track just down the road from the main engineering facility. And it's not fair to compare it to an M3, but it's fair enough to compare it to what was one of the sporty diesel models that they had at the time, the most powerful diesel. And it was, because it had a lower rear axle ratio, it was really fast in acceleration. So it was really pretty quick. And because it was light, and it had a lower frontal area, it's aerodynamically quite good, it was more than competitive. So they were over the moon because they didn't, it was 1,000 kilos. So that was the weight target. It just about made it, a little bit over, I think. 1,000 kilos is very light. You get a lot of performance. You also get a lot of agility with a light car. So it wasn't just the acceleration, it was the manner with which it got there because it was so light. So everybody was just over the moon with the way it drove. So there's, and so much goodwill. I mean, I had the guy who was doing the marketing for it. I mean, everybody was getting together with me. I mean, I was getting almost inundated with help from people, offering their recollections and things of it. There's so much goodwill inside the company to that car.
Lovely. So the reaction was good. People wanted to see this car produced, but what were the headwinds into actually getting the thing into production when reality strikes, right?
Well, there was one simple reality, which was Rover. So this was the very time when BMW was struggling to know what to do with Rover. And it had to figure out what to do in terms of investment. Do you invest money in a fairly low volume specialist BMW, or do you invest it in putting the money into a fairly high volume hatchback that will save, hopefully, this troubled Rover. And that's really what they decided to do. It was a nice to have, not a need to have. And they desperately needed to make the investment in Rover, and they didn't desperately need to have another cheaper version of the 3 Series, in truth. So perhaps wisely, I think, in some respects. Although people like Ralph Langmuir and the guys involved in it, absolutely certain that it would sell. There's another element to it, which is the vehicle as it was designed had in the late 90s BMW look to it. But of course, the design language was always moving forward, as it does today. So it would have had to go through another pass of redesign. So they did do that. Chris Chapman, as an American designer, he had another pass at redesigning and modernizing the design, because it really got a little bit old by then from when Andreas Sapatinus had done it 5 to 6 years earlier. But it was really the Rover thing that kind of killed it. They needed to make the investment.
Yeah. So it's a real shame, but it would have been a cool car. But how did the 2002 concept morph into the 1 Series, which of course we got in 2004, and then the coupe in 2007?
Well, that's where everybody comes around. The same players come around in the same story: Ralph Langmuir, Chris Chapman. So imagine you go into a lull where Rover is then disposed of, and all of a sudden BMW now has the freedom to introduce a car under the 3 Series, and the market's developing. And the new chief engineer was formerly the 3 Series engineering boss, and he said to Ralph Langmuir, pulled him to one side at this big corporate meeting off site, and he said, "Is it time to do your car?" And Ralph said, "It's absolutely always time to do this car. Yes, we must do this car." The designers wanted it to be a coupe type 2-door, but the marketing people said, "Look, the volume is in the hatch. You're going to have to do a 5-door hatchback." And Chris Chapman, who really wanted to design a small compact coupe 02 type car, was like, "I don't want to do a 5-door." And so Chris Chapman was told by his boss, Chris Bangle, "Do a coupe, and if it wins, then you have to do the 5-door. But the 5-door, we'll fight with marketing, but maybe we'll have to do the 5-door first." In truth, his car did win, but he then had to redesign it as a 5-door immediately, and that was the car that was launched. And so the coupe that was the 1 Series coupe came out some years later, as you say, 2004, 2005, and that's a good 10 years after Andreas Sapatinus's first sketch. And yet there's still a sort of fairly emotive visual relationship between the two, even though it spans 10 years. But yeah, Chris Chapman did the final pass of 2002, and he also did the 1 Series coupe. So there is absolutely a relationship between them.
And I've noticed there was a CS1 concept that BMW created around 2002. And how did that relate to this whole 1 Series thing?
Well, that was the car that introduced the 1 Series, but Chris Bangle thought it'd be a great idea to make it as a convertible. That way it doesn't show off the roof, so you're not showing everything. But Chris, being a fairly creative thinker, thought, we'll trick all the press by making the car 5% smaller, so that everybody thinks that the production car is going to be the same and it's going to be really cramped. So the CS1 is essentially a 2-door version of the 5-door hatchback, but 5% smaller in every dimension, so that people thought the car was going to be much more cramped than the production car that was actually 5% bigger. But the problem was, he realized afterwards it was a bit of a bad idea, because they had to redesign and redraw everything. So they had to design 2 cars that were identical in many respects, but 5% difference in size. So the CS1 was there to introduce the 1 Series, but although history doesn't know until now, it was actually smaller than the car that came out.
So essentially the CS1 was an evolution of what had come out of the 2002 ideas.
It was, and also an evolution of the 1 Series. So it was sort of born between the production 1 Series. But of course, like a lot of car companies, BMW will show a pre-series concept to sort of trail what's coming. So the CS1 was essentially a 1 Series. And by then, Chris had moved on to doing the one. Chris Chapman had moved on to doing the 1 Series, and the 2K2 was pretty much gone by then. But of course, nobody knew behind the scenes because none of this was discussed.
Okay, so I must admit, so this is a great story that you've put in your book. But the first thing I thought when I was reading it is, why didn't BMW just get the 3 Series coupe, put a 2002 special edition badge on the back? Because at this point, they've run out of time to actually make a 2002. You've got to get it done by 2002. So you could celebrate 2002 by just doing a special edition 3 Series coupe. It's quick to create. You get a few sales, cash in on the whole 2002 thing. Why didn't they do that? Was that just like a cheap thing for BMW to do, and that's not really their style? It's
not their style. I mean, in some ways, BMW is obsessively true to itself. I mean, and this is praise, not criticism, but it might sound like it is. They do really overthink things sometimes, and they are really prone to self-analysis. And to them, their ethos is, if you're going to do it properly. And it's fair to say, if you're going to do that idea of a 2002 car, you need to be making that decision back in 1999, year 2000. That was back in the days of Rover. So it wasn't really a consideration at that time because, frankly, they had to worry about their day-to-day situation with Rover, which was hemorrhaging cash for them, of course. So I can see why they might have considered it very quickly in the meeting, but the purists in the company would say, let's hold.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, thank you for this, Steve. Just one last question. So doing these books, it's taken you 2.5 years to do these BMW books. You've been immersed in BMW, but BMW really took a leap by essentially giving you unprecedented access to everything. So what was that like?
It was not intimidating, but it was charming. It was bewildering where Adrian Van Hooydonk, I mentioned, the chief designer, and I quickly agreed that if we were going to do it, it was going to be completely unfettered access. What I hadn't expected was just the enthusiasm within the people that never see the outside world. They just got so excited. I remember one guy who's he's a package engineer. So this is the guy who arranges where all the bits go. And he said, I don't even tell my wife what I'm working on. I don't even tell her what I really do. He said, I had to call Adrian to figure out if I was even allowed to talk to you. I've worked here over 20 years. I've never been allowed to talk to anybody ever. And he was so excited. And they were all like that. The guys at BMW have got all these stories. And because it's an independent book, my job is just to tell the story. So there's a little bit where the stories come to life through the people as well as the cars. And there's such a human, I mean, it's a horrible phrase, I know, but such a human company. It's full of really strong personalities that love what they do. They're not arrogant. They are just in love with the proposition of being a BMW. And to be trusted was absolutely, I mean, it's easy to say it's an honor, but it really was something I'd never experienced in my life. To expect a company that's not known for just being so open to say, come on in, sit with us, talk with us, whatever you like. They were really good, actually, to work with. I cannot thank them enough. They were great, really.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks for sharing this wonderful story about the 2002 that should have been. So,
right.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure in that case, and it's always fun to share great stories.